All right. Hey, everybody. Professor Jeff here. Welcome back. It is good to see you again. So we are going to begin today with Chapter 1 of The River Speaks by Jeff Noor. This is the first chapter that really introduces some of the ideas and the ways that we are going to talk about poetry this semester. And all I'm going to do, just like some of the videos that you may have already watched, is read through the text out loud for you. I'll pause a little bit and explain some ideas if I think there's important information that I want to add to what Professor Noor already has in here. And of course, I get to read the poems to you, which I'm really, really excited to do, because if we were together in the same classroom, of course, we'd all get to share and read poems with each other. So I'm very happy that I'll get to read the poems out loud for you as well, because so much of poetry is sounds, right? Of course, the images, the words are very, very important. And more than anything, as you know, we're going to read through in this chapter and in other chapters in the book, poetry is meant to be heard, meant to be spoken and meant to be heard. So I think that's why it's really important to read through some of these things out loud. But we are here in Chapter 1, page 1. This chapter is called Survivalist Poetics. And just follow along with me if you'd like to, and enjoy. So when reading poetry, whether we're an experienced reader or not, one thing is certain. Poetry ought to move us. It ought to knock us down with the force of a boxer. It might make us cry out loud over a page. It may move us to very simple and quiet contemplation of our own life. Poetry may slow us down in the rest of our life, make us late for work or class or meeting friends at a local pub. It might strike fear in us. It may confuse us to no end. And poetry may turn us inside out without warning. When I read poetry and when I read it with my own classes, I hope it does all these things. Sometimes people wonder why they should care if these things happen at all. Well, one answer, simply put, is if any of the above-mentioned things happen to us, we hopefully learn to live better. Here's an Audre Lorde quote on page 2. Poetry is not a luxury. It is a vital necessity of our existence. It forms the quality of light within on which we predicate our hopes and dreams toward survival and change, first made into language, then into an idea, then into more tangible action. Now, often students ask how they should come to know, quote, the answer to a poem and what it means. So my answer to this is twofold. One, so tell me, Sonia, what does the poem mean to you? Why are you reacting to it? And two, remember to think about and know a little bit about the author, when they might have written the work, what country or region they're from, political happenings of the time and language meaning. Now that's all a bit technical in its work. Sonia, and anyone else, always has an answer, and that's important. Now I usually find that this answer is most likely tied to the author's meaning of the poem or a critical meaning of the poem. Now take Sonia, for instance. In a past class, we read Jimmy Santiago Baca's poem Green Chile, and then I asked the class to comment on this poem, first from the question number 1 position. And remember, question number 1 is just, what does it mean to you? And that's something I love that Professor Noor does in this book, is we start with how we feel, right? It's not about what we should understand from the poem or what the poem is supposed to mean. We are always going to start with, what'd you think when you read it? What did it make you feel, right? So take Sonia, for instance. In a past class, we read Jimmy Santiago Baca's poem Green Chile, and then I asked the class to comment on this poem first from the question number 1 position. The poem discusses a relationship with a grandmother, one that is formed over food, one that's formed over heritage and generations, and about politics impinging upon the Latino culture. So let's look at the poem. Green Chile by Jimmy Santiago Baca. I prefer red chile over my eggs and potatoes for breakfast. Red chile rastras decorate my door, dry on my roof, and hang from the eaves. They lend open-air vegetable stands historical grandeur and gently swing with an air of festive welcome. I can hear them talking in the wind, haggard, yellowing, crisp, rasping tongues of old men licking the breeze. But grandmother loves green chile, When I visit her, she holds the green chile pepper in her wrinkled hands. Ah, voluptuous, masculine, an air of authority and youth simmers from its swan-neck stem, tapering to a flowery collar, fermenting resinous spice. A well-dressed gentleman at the door my grandmother takes sensuously in her hand, rubbing its firm-glossed sides, caressing the oily, rubbery serpent with mouth-watering fulfillment, fondling its curves with gentle fingers. Its bearing magnificent and taut as flanks of a tiger in mid-leap, she thrusts her blade and cuts it open, with lust on her hot mouth, sweating over the stove, bandana round her forehead, mysterious passion on her face, and she serves me green chile con carne between soft, warm leaves of corn tortillas, with beans and rice, her sacrifice to her little prince. I slurp from my plate with the last bit of tortilla. My mouth burns and I hiss and drink a tall glass of cold water. All over New Mexico, sunburned men and women drive rickety trucks stuffed with gunny sacks of green chile from Belén, Veguita, Willard, Estancia, San Antonio, y Socorro. From fields to roadside stands you see them roasting green chile in screen-sided homemade barrels. And for $1 a bag, we relive this old, beautiful ritual again and again. Well, Sonia quickly raised her hand and said, "Look, this is funny, the way he starts by saying he likes red chile, because I prefer it too. I mean, who eats green chiles on their eggs?" She was interested. She had me interested. And Baca had her right where he wanted her. She went on, "Then he goes to this grandma's house where he's just loving this green chile she makes. Then he gets kind of lustful about the chiles, which is a bit weird, but that's kind of funny too, because he's got his grandma lusting over the chiles and they're hot and whatever." Sonia stopped, a bit unsure of her answer now, as if she walked way off her path. What she doesn't realize is that Baca is right next to her, like a spirit. Then she stops. Justin, a horse ranching kid from a nearby farming and logging community, jumped in at the pause. "You know, I totally relate to this poem, and you know what? It is funny, man. I never saw the humor in it until just now when Sonia was talking. Anyway, I used to go to my grandmother's house all the time for her pancakes and..." He pauses. Then Justin keeps going and he's on target. "Anyway, I'd actually get up early on Saturdays, even if I was out late Friday, to get all my morning farm work done so I could ditch my house and go down the road for breakfast with my grandparents. My dad always made pancakes too on Saturdays, but my grandma's were better. They were this Scandinavian kind she'd had in her house for generations, and she made it from a starter she kept in the freezer. My grandfather swore it was from the original, like 300 years ago or something." Now I'm watching and listening to Justin, knowing he's on top of the poem, and I'm waiting for him to make his turn. Anyway, we used to eat pancakes and talk, and I used to hear all about my family. Anyway, this poem is about how chiles are what glues his family together, like when his grandmother dies and is gone forever. Anytime he eats a chile, it will bring her alive again, and he'll always feel connected. Bam! There's Justin, nailed into the poem. Now, Sonia piped up again, and now she feels back on the trail. See, she, who is Latina herself, begins to talk about culture and food and some of her views of politics in America and life in her ethnic community. And after half an hour of discussing the poem in class, this group hasn't even touched overtly on critical poetic elements like metaphor and lines and stanzas, and that's fine. We'd get there. Right? Had they been knocked out, slowed down considerably? I mean, most had, if not before class, at least by the end. We'd all had family bonding experiences over food, and this became the avenue by which people began to enter the poem. So, I've gone on a bit about this poem and a past discussion, but my point is, if we search our own personal and human background and try to relate it to the poem we're reading, and we look carefully at the language the poet has used, most often we will be touched. Maybe knocked out, turned inside out without warning. I mean, it is the poet's job to write about life, about what it means to be human. And the hardest job of the writer is to make what's most private and unsensational to him, sensational to the reader. Where do poems come from? Now, finding subject matter worthy enough for a poem can be one of the most difficult things a writer encounters. But this very notion of finding something worthy enough is problematic because the writer is saying that the poem deserves something better than he's come up with. This, unfortunately, is a losing battle in the search for good subject matter. So how does a writer win? A poet finds subject matter that is moving, accessible, human. After all, people like to read about the world they live in, so writers write about it. So as readers, we need to attempt to see the world as a place filled with stories and poems. And if we don't, when a poet writes about these things, we may just miss the point of the poem or misunderstand the context in which the poet places the poem. There are poems hiding all around us. They're in corners of the room in spider webs. They're in the smooth handle of my grandfather's hammer in the garage. They're in the French toast for breakfast, and they're on the lawn of the old lady who lives across the street. In an interview by Dave Smith, James Wright was asked about the subject matter for his poem, quote, Lying in a Hammock at William Duffy's Farm in Pine Island, Minnesota. And he said that he was not trying to do anything heroic in that poem, but rather he was trying to capture a moment in his life where he felt a sense of delight. What he means by not being heroic is that the poem need not work on a grand level. It doesn't need to conquer us. It just needs to show us something and capture a moment. But in doing so, it is the type of poem that may move us. For these moments are often the smallest and most non-heroic moments, and for this reason, they're also the most human. And often, this type of poem forms itself into a short poem that is designed to express the thoughts, reflections, or feelings of the poet or persona, which is known in poetry as a lyric. Sometimes, as readers, we may search too hard for the great idea, only to have missed what the poem might be about. For instance, the last line of Mr. Wright's poem may be screaming out to be considered, but at the heart of the poem are all these objects being noticed along the way to the last line. Over the years, it may have been put into our heads that poems must be larger than life, must have something great to say, but poems are only great when they touch us, and when they tell us about our humanness and our histories. So I often read and write by this principle. Find a simple moment, a moment that's normal to me, but seems normal to the author, maybe a quiet but striking image in the poem, and figure out what's important at the center of it. So let's take a look at James Wright's poem. And here, Professor Knorr tells us, gives us a definition. A lyric poem is a short poem that's designed to express the thoughts, reflections, or feelings of the poet or persona. And again, this poem is an example. Lying in a Hammock at William Duffy's Farm in Pine Island, Minnesota by James Wright. Over my head, I see the bronze butterfly asleep on the black trunk, blowing like a leaf in green shadow. Down the ravine, behind the empty house, the cowbells follow another into the distance of the afternoon. To my right, in a field of sunlight between two pines, the droppings of last year's horses blaze up into golden stones. I lean back as the evening darkens and comes on. A chicken hawk floats over, looking for home. I've wasted my life. Seeing the world as poetic. So now that we've figured out how to find the poems, to know their hiding places, at least sometimes, we need to figure out how to make this a regular event. If we can do this in our own lives, then poetry is less daunting when we face it in a book because we know a little bit about how a poet is thinking. Consider this the reading process off the page. This is the part where we begin to put the process of reading into how we see everyday events. But to be able to do this, we have to be open to redefining our world, to be ready to view it and define it in any moment, and especially at the moment of reading. So let's step back for a moment. If we go through the process of asking ourselves what we've noticed in the past 2 weeks that we haven't noticed before, what happens is that for one instance we stop or slow down long enough to see in our mind's eye a few new objects. And more, we slow ourselves long enough to let that thing take hold of us. So if we apply this principle to reading a poem and slow ourselves, as well as being receptive to new subject matter, then we're likely to make some discovery along the way. Take, for example, a small child. He might go out to walk around the block, but how long does this take? When I walked with my son when he was 2 years old, a walk around the block might take 40 minutes because every few yards he said, "Look, Papa, a bug," or "Look, Papa, a truck." The list of things he noticed was endless, and most of them were rather exceptional findings, especially for him. He was 2, and some of these things he had never seen. But to define them in new ways, to watch the way a caterpillar moves, is to see things as fresh. And to couple these with feelings, to put the concrete with the abstract, is to begin to realize poetry. So I began to note these things on our walks around the block and how many poems live on our block. Let's spend a moment probing this idea of coupling concrete images with abstract thoughts or feelings. For instance, these words like tragic, harrowing, or sad mean little because they're abstracts. Without images to represent them, it's hard to relate to or attach to them. And since poets create images regularly when they work with subject matter, as a reader we can look to images to hold some power in a poem. Concrete images allow abstracts to remain below the surface, and thereby function as a subtle implicit force in a poem. Hence, when reading, we have to work with both the literal meanings and the range of possibilities behind those literal meanings. So take, for instance, the following image, the desire to hold someone. The image itself is concrete, but the emotion and the desire for connection is left below the surface of the image. How I want to reach you. Slip my hands past your canvas coat and hold you in the barn light as night folds its dark clench over us. Note that in this image, it's largely working based on its concrete parts. The two abstract notions come in the first and fourth lines. The first line gives us the sense that the lovers are apart, and there's longing and desire packed in the phrase, "how I want." And in the fourth line, there's a sense of near violence with the word clench. But let's not apply that to the lovers because it's the night that has clenched them. So we might ask, do they feel like there are forces at work against them? Forces they're hiding from? Forces that may drive them apart? We don't know yet. But if we're asking these questions, we'd hope to see something happen around these ideas later in the poem. Now, as a reader, we want to remember that poems are representing the world to us. There are certainly thoughts and emotions in them and behind them, but there's no conspiracy against us by poets. They're not trying to confuse us. They aren't trying to set up a sea of words where we drown a slow and suffering death. Rather, they're attempting to capture some image and vision of the world where we will feel and think about our own and others' lives. They simply want us to see and experience the world. Poets want us to walk with them slowly, instead of speeding off on the freeway only to miss all that's whizzing by. The reader is the hunted. I'm going to use a metaphor here for how we might view ourselves as a reader in relation to the poet. If we use hunting as a metaphor, the reader is the hunted. And when we read a poem and we stop and say, "Oh man, that's my life. Oh, I can't believe somebody else feels that way," we've been hit by bullet, sling, or arrow. We've been brought down by the hunter. However, the poet, unlike the real hunter, isn't trying to kill us, but to stop us in our tracks, to catch us during a moment of grazing or perching, maybe even running to and from work or school, and have us focus our life in a different direction. Most writers would tell us that the language of our daily life, advertising, radio, TV, pop music, the newspaper, is utilitarian. And usually, in our capitalist society, the language is there to get something out of us. Money, a vote, a piece of who we are. The poet's aim is to get us to stop for a moment and be absolutely stunned by our own life, and see it in relation to the lives of others. So we can come to the reading experience with the expectation that the writer is creating something for us that is an honest expression of language, of their experience, and an expression of the time in which they've lived. Now, we ought to want this. I realize that's a bold statement, one that brings back childhood memories of our mothers and fathers saying, "Eat your spinach, it's good for you." Our response was something like, "Not on your life." And it's a reasonable response. I mean, if I tell a class, "You ought to like this poetry stuff," some people think I'm out of my head. But let's remember that we've come to like broccoli, spinach, asparagus, or chard. Poetry is rooted for us not in gimmicks or tricks. It's rooted in life. And when poets use that language, which knocks us down when they present life to us, if we engage in the lives of others, hopefully it's taught us to live better. Poetry is not utilitarian, but I'll say this about you applying poetry to your life in a seemingly utilitarian way. Students ask me all the time in classes how poetry will help them later, and I say something like this: look, if you like poetry at best, or at least have found a few poems you like and you understand the genre at worst, here's how it works. Maybe you're a science major and you simply take to noticing things more, noticing the fine interconnectedness of things, and you begin to see those relationships as somewhat poetic, a dance among cells. Maybe in your daily life it's simply noticing the people around us and how they act or react. Possibly we've slowed ourselves down enough to look closely at the system we're living in and its effect on us as people. Maybe in a tragic and horribly unfortunate situation, we have a family member who's very ill, and because we've read a poem about this, we might be able to calculate something about how they're feeling, and we're able to be someone solid for them. Maybe years from now, we'll find poetry creeping on us at very unexpected moments. And that may be utilitarian, but that's also at the core of living better, about our personal goals, about how we affect others, and ultimately reconciling with ourselves how we go about our daily business. To be in the eye of that storm of poetry or daily living is at the heart of our survivalist poetics. And then at the end of each chapter, Professor Noor gives us some suggestions, things to do in our daily lives, and then, of course, things that you can do if you want to write, right? Start to write. So, to experience. 1, he says, think about something you've noticed in the past 2 weeks that you haven't noticed before. Then, analyze its potential as a poetic subject. If you were to write a poem about this thing, would it be a good subject and why? 2, look around your kitchen at some food objects. Cereal, an apple, cookies, chips, broccoli, rice, pasta, tortillas, milk, beer, etc. Which one might make a good subject for a poem and why? And then to write. Choose a poem you've read and write a short essay or journal entry discussing why the poem is an important poem to read and make an argument for why it is or will be a lasting piece of literary art. So I hope you enjoyed that chapter. I hope it encouraged you to think about poetry in a new or a different way. Or if it wasn't new to you and you're on board, you totally agree with all these ideas, that's great, because this is how we're going to think about poems, right? We get to talk about structure, lines, stanzas, rhyme scheme, feet, meter, all that good stuff. But if it doesn't mean something to you, it just won't matter. So I'm never going to tell you that you have to like a poem or that this is a great poem, some objectively great poem. I can tell you why I think certain poems are good. I can tell you what I like about poetry. But the only thing that really matters, if poetry is going to teach you anything, is that you think about poems that mean something to you. And I think that's what that's what I feel when I read about Professor Noor talking about survivalist poetics. So I hope you enjoyed this chapter. I hope it makes you excited to read more poems, because we definitely have more poems to read in Professor Noor's book, and then, of course, poems that we're going to read in our class this semester. So thanks for watching this video, and can't wait to see you soon.